Hey everyone, Pat Fitzmaurice of FantasyPros here to give you the 10 best fantasy football draft value picks for 2024. These are players I'm going to be looking to draft in my leagues as we move into the heart of fantasy draft season. And I'll get to that list in just a moment. But first, we're all familiar with that feeling of uncertainty during our fantasy football drafts. Not having a game plan or knowing if your picks align with your league setting can hurt your chances of winning your league and getting your hands on that trophy. This year, eliminate that uncertainty with the FantasyPros Cheat Sheet Creator. It's your personal guide to creating perfect rankings tailored specifically to your league. Visualize your path to victory as you add tiers and sync your league in order to craft custom rankings. The Cheat Sheet Creator adapts to your unique league settings, ensuring that every pick is strategic. Transform your draft day into a confident and enjoyable experience. Use the Cheat Sheet Creator at fantasypros.com/draftwizard or on our Fantasy Football Draft Wizard app and dominate your draft. Now for my 10 best fantasy football draft value picks for 2024. Let's start with a couple of quarterbacks. First up is Kyler Murray with an ADP of QB10, 71st overall. Kyler Murray has averaged 20.8 fantasy points per game over a 5-year career, covering 65 starts for the Cardinals. An average of 20.8 points would have made him the QB5 in fantasy points per game last season. And Murray has not exactly had a great supporting cast during his tenure with the Cardinals. Now the Cardinals have a terrific young wide receiver in Marvin Harrison Jr., who was the number 4 overall pick in this year's NFL draft, and an outstanding young tight end in Trey McBride. Arizona's offensive line might not be great, but it's at least respectable. PFF graded the Cardinals 17th in pass blocking last season. What largely drives Kyler Murray's fantasy value is his mobility. Rushing ability is a fantasy cheat code for quarterbacks, and Kyler is one of the better running quarterbacks in the league. He's averaged 37.7 rushing yards per game over his career, and he has 26 career touchdown runs. Kyler had 11 TD runs back in 2020, so there is serious rushing upside here. I also really like the value on Trevor Lawrence, who has an ADP of QB17, 107th overall. The number 1 pick of the 2021 NFL Draft, Lawrence had a forgettable rookie season under the nightmarish 1-year Urban Meyer regime in Jacksonville, but he's become a solid fantasy quarterback in the 2 years since, and there might still be some untapped potential with Lawrence. In 2022, Lawrence ranked QB12 in fantasy points per game among quarterbacks who made at least 6 starts. Last year, he was QB15 in fantasy points per game. So Lawrence has established himself as at least a low-end QB1 or high-end QB2, yet he's being drafted as more of a mid-range QB2. Lawrence has topped 4,000 passing yards in each of the last 2 years. He ended the 2023 season on a heater. In his final 7 starts, Lawrence averaged 270.9 passing yards a game with 12 TD passes and 4 TD runs. He isn't quite the runner that Kyler Murray is, but Lawrence nonetheless adds some value in that department. He's averaged 321 rushing yards a season since entering the league, with 9 touchdown runs over the last 2 years. Now for a few of my favorite running back values. Kenneth Walker has an ADP of RB16, 52nd overall. I think he's a nice value at that price. Walker is fast and athletic. He ran for 1,600 yards and scored 19 touchdowns in his final college season at Michigan State. And a lot of draft analysts thought he was every bit the running back prospect that Breece Hall was in 2021. In his 2 NFL seasons, Walker's averaged just under 80 yards from scrimmage per game in Seattle, with 9 touchdowns in each of those years. PFF gave Walker the 8th highest rushing grade of any back with 60 or more rushing attempts last season. Now, some people might be shying away from Walker due to the presence of Zach Charbonnet, a second-round draft pick last year. But in games that Walker and Charbonnet both played together last year, Walker averaged 15.7 touches a game, Charbonnet averaged 7.4 touches a game. I've also heard several people express concern that the Seahawks might be ultra pass heavy this year under new offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb, but Seattle passed at the 5th highest rate in the league last year, so they're unlikely to be significantly more pass heavy than they were in 2023. And here's a fun little factoid. Walker has forced more missed tackles than any other running back in the league over the last 2 seasons. There's one rookie on my top 10 list. It's Blake Corum of the LA Rams, who has an ADP of RB38, 119th overall. This is all about high upside, and Blake Corum has considerable upside. You saw what sort of fantasy impact Kyren Williams had for the Rams last year. He averaged 21.3 PPR fantasy points per game, second only to Christian McCaffrey among running backs. Yes, Kyren is still the number 1 running back for the Rams. Even if Blake Corum is only a handcuff this season, he is perhaps the most essential handcuff in fantasy football, and his RB38 price is a fair one to pay for that floor. But the potential upside is so much higher. Kyren Williams is an undersized former 5th-round draft pick who missed 5 games last year. Corum was a 3rd-round draft pick this year. The draft capital suggests that the Rams aren't going to let Corum collect cobwebs on the bench, so it's possible he'll have some standalone value. Now, if Kyren Williams were to miss some time due to injury, Corum would become an automatic start with top 10 weekly upside. Corum ran for 2,700 yards and scored 47 touchdowns over his final 2 college seasons at Michigan. I think he's the best pure runner in this rookie class. If you buy Blake Corum at his modest price, you'll be holding what could prove to be a winning lottery ticket. Now for possibly my favorite draft value of 2024, Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals, who has an ADP of RB40, 120th overall. Joe Mixon has left Cincinnati, and the Bengals didn't draft any running backs, so it's likely to be some combination of Zach Moss and Chase Brown at running back for the Bengals this year. Moss has been in the league for 4 seasons. He was widely considered to be a disappointment until early last year, when Moss went berserk for the Colts while Jonathan Taylor was on injured reserve, and Moss also had a huge game against the Titans when Taylor came off IR and the Colts decided to work JT back into action slowly. But from week 6 on, Moss averaged 3.7 yards per carry and wasn't nearly as effective as he had been in the early weeks. Moss isn't fast or explosive. He isn't a prolific pass catcher. Chase Brown is fast. Chase Brown was good as a pass catcher last year. It wasn't a big sample size, but Chase Brown averaged 10.4 yards per target in 2023. It's possible Brown plays a major role in a Bengals offense that has Joe Burrow at quarterback and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins at wide receiver. Bengals running backs are probably going to be running against light boxes all year, and lest anyone question whether Chase Brown could play the Joe Mixon role if the Bengals decided he's simply a better player than Moss, consider that Chase Brown averaged 27.3 carries a game and 29.6 touches a game in his final college season at Illinois. He had 1,883 yards from scrimmage and 13 touchdowns in 12 games that year. Chase Brown is a steal at RB40, and I think he'll still be a value even if his ADP climbs a little bit. On to the wide receiver position. For an early round receiver value, I like Jaylen Waddle at an ADP of wide receiver 17, 30th overall. Waddle has been in the league for 3 years, and he's eclipsed 1,000 yards all 3 years. He had to share targets with Tyreek Hill for 2 of those 3 seasons, and Waddle still cleared the 1,000-yard bar last year despite missing 3 games. Waddle's efficiency numbers show how good he is. 10.7 yards per target over the last 2 years, and almost 2.5 yards per route run over the last 2 years. Jaylen Waddle is a terrific football player. And here's a reason why I think Waddle could smash this year. The Dolphins defense has lost a lot of talent in free agency, and they also lost defensive coordinator Vic Fangio, who's now with the Eagles. Miami's defense could be terrible, which could turn a lot of Dolphins games into shootouts where Tua Tagovailoa has to throw like crazy. Jaylen Waddle has a mid-third round ADP, but I think he's worth considering late in the 2nd round. Next up, Amari Cooper, who checks in with an ADP of wide receiver 25, 45th overall. This is the sort of boring but sensible value pick for a veteran that stabilizes a fantasy roster. In his 2 seasons with the Browns, Amari Cooper has finished wide receiver 18 and wide receiver 17 among receivers who played at least 6 games. That's in fantasy points per game, not overall. Last year, Joe Flacco pumped life into the Cleveland passing game late in the year when he took over as the starting quarterback. Tight end David Njoku went from being a fantasy afterthought to being a major impact player late in the year, but Cooper was the only Browns pass catcher who was valuable with both Flacco and with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. Cooper had 90 or more receiving yards in 4 of the 5 games Watson started and finished last season. Cooper also averaged 121 yards in the 4 games he played with Joe Flacco, including a monstrous 265-yard, 2-touchdown game against the Texans in Week 16 that propelled a lot of fantasy teams into their championship games. Don't overthink it with Amari Cooper. Just draft this ultra-reliable veteran at a discount sticker price. I also really like Terry McLaurin at an ADP of wide receiver 32, 63rd overall. McLaurin has recorded 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons with at least 77 catches in all 4 of those years. The quarterbacks with whom McLaurin has played at least 2 games during that span: Dwayne Haskins, Kyle Allen, late career Alex Smith, Carson Wentz, Taylor Heineke, Sam Howell, and Jacoby Brissett. Not exactly a murderer's row of NFL quarterbacks. I'd like to think that number 2 overall draft pick Jayden Daniels can take McLaurin to new heights. McLaurin hasn't scored more than 5 touchdowns in any of the last 4 years, and he's now going to be playing with a quarterback who threw 31 touchdown passes to wide receivers Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas Jr. in 13 games at LSU last season. Also, new Commanders offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury runs his offenses at a fast pace, and the Washington defense looks pretty sketchy on paper, which could lead to a lot of high-scoring track meets for the Commanders. Let's look at one nice late-round value at receiver. It's Brandin Cooks at wide receiver 57, 134th overall. Cooks drew only 81 targets in 16 games during his first season with the Cowboys. Maybe Cooks and Dak Prescott weren't entirely on the same page last year. They were reportedly clicking in OTAs this year. Cooks turns 31 shortly after the season begins, so he's an older player, but not that old. The Cowboys didn't make any significant offseason additions at wide receiver, so Cooks figures to be the clear number 2 in Dallas behind CeeDee Lamb, and we know that Lamb is going to draw a lot of defensive attention, creating opportunities for other Dallas pass catchers. And by the way, even though Cooks produced only 657 receiving yards last season, he did manage to score 8 touchdowns. I think Cooks is a sneaky value late in fantasy drafts. And let's wrap up with a tight end. The Steelers' Pat Freiermuth has an ADP of tight end 15, 124th overall. 2 years ago, when he stayed reasonably healthy all year, Freiermuth had 732 receiving yards. The Steelers don't have a lot of firepower at wide receiver other than George Pickens, who hasn't always commanded a lot of targets. Freiermuth could play a substantial role in the Pittsburgh passing game, and he's being drafted in tight end 2 range. It's also worth noting that while new Steelers offensive coordinator Arthur Smith might not be a favorite of fantasy managers, he is a former tight ends coach, and with Smith as the Falcons head coach and play caller last year, Falcons tight ends combined for 174 targets, 114 catches, 1,380 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Those are my 10 favorite fantasy football draft value picks for 2024. Now go out there and crush all of your fantasy drafts.